right, so get this today. We're going deep on something you don't hear much about, but it's a big deal for therapy.
Oh, yeah.
It's all about how self-aware the therapist is, like how much their own journey can actually impact you, the client.
Yeah, it's funny. We always think about what we bring to therapy,
Right.
but we don't really think about the therapist's own stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And we found this awesome blog post by the Multicultural Counseling Service.
Okay.
And they get into this whole thing about how a therapist being self-aware is like their most important tool,
That's true.
even more than degrees or, fancy techniques.
Right. It's like imagine a mechanic with all the best tools, but they don't even know how an engine works.
Got
They might fix a few things here and there, but they're not going to get to the root of the problem.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
So how does this whole therapist as an instrument thing actually, like, work in therapy?
Well, think about it this way. So a therapist who's really self-aware, they know their strengths,
Yeah.
but they also know their weaknesses. So let's say a therapist is amazing with anxiety,
Mm,
but maybe they struggle with grief counseling.
right.
So knowing that they can either get more training,
Yeah.
or even better, refer you to someone who's a better fit.
So that's a good thing if a therapist knows what they're not good at.
Absolutely.
Like they're putting my needs before their ego.
Yeah, it shows they're professional and ethical,
Right.
and it builds trust because it shows they're human.
That makes me feel better, honestly.
Oh.
I think a lot of us think therapists have it all figured out.
Right.
But what about like avoiding bias? Everyone has opinions and beliefs.
Mm.
How could they be non-judgmental, like the blog says?
Well, so therapists have tons of training to be non-judgmental. They learn to separate their own values from their work, and they're always looking at themselves and even talking to other therapists to check for biases.
Wow, it sounds like a lot of work.
It's a process.
And the blog had this quote, "We are all the same but completely different."
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
What does that even mean for bias?
Well, it means that everyone has shared experiences, but we're also all individuals,
Okay.
It reminds therapists to be curious and open and not let their own assumptions get in the way.
So how can therapists find those hidden biases that they don't even know they have?
Well, one way is something called the Johari Window.
Okay.
It's this model. It's got 4 parts,
Right.
and each part shows a different side of ourselves.
Interesting.
It's like a window into your personality. Some parts you and others can see, some parts are hidden, and some parts only others see, like blind spots.
Blind spot. Okay, so how would a therapist actually use this Johari window?
Okay, so let's say a therapist has trouble connecting with clients from a certain background.
Mm.
They might realize, using the Johari window, that they have unconscious biases,
Oh,
things they didn't even realize.
wow.
So by bringing those blind spots out in the open, they can start working on them.
So it's not just about thinking about yourself, it's about using that to be better with clients. That's cool.
And this brings us to another important point. The blog talks about therapists going to therapy themselves.
Wait, therapists go to therapy.
It's actually really common and encouraged.
I never thought about that.
Yeah, because just like everyone else, therapists need a space to process their own stuff,
Yeah, that makes sense.
like their own emotions, experiences, and baggage.
So it helps them understand themselves better.
Exactly, and that helps them be better therapists.
Wow. So far, we've talked about the therapist as an instrument thing and how their self-awareness can really affect whether they can help you.
It's true.
We talked about avoiding bias and using the Johari window to figure out blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're learning therapists go to therapy too.
Right.
This is a lot.
It is. It's a complex topic.
But I'm curious about this idea that therapists are supposed to fix you.
Yeah, that's a big myth. Therapy isn't about quick fixes or magic solutions.
So they don't have all the answers.
No, it's more about giving you the power to change and heal yourself.
So they're more like guides than like mechanics.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They're there to support you, give you insights and tools, but the power to change comes from within.
That makes sense. And that reminds me of something else the blog said about techniques just being tools.
Yeah.
And not every tool works for every job.
Right, like those CBT charts the blog talked about.
Yeah.
They can be helpful for some, but for others, they might be too much.
So what happens if a technique doesn't work for a client?
Well, that's where good communication comes in. A good therapist is open to feedback, and they're willing to change the plan. They're not going to make you do something that feels wrong.
Feels like a team effort.
Exactly. Therapy is collaborative. You have a voice in how it goes.
That's good to know because I always thought it was more like the therapist is the expert
Yeah.
and I just follow their lead?
It's definitely a partnership.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here about how important a therapist's self-awareness is,
We have.
but I'm still wondering, how can I even tell if a therapist is self-aware in the first place?
That's a great question and a tricky one. But there are definitely some things you can look for and questions you can ask even during that first meeting to get a sense of their self-awareness.
Okay, I'm ready for the secrets. Spill the beans.
All right, well, let's take a quick break and then we'll dive into those tips. You know, it's funny, we've talked about like therapists as instruments and self-awareness and bias and the Johari window,
Right.
even therapists going to therapy themselves. But
Yeah.
we haven't really talked about like the most important thing.
Oh, I know what you mean, that connection between the therapist and client.
Yes, exactly. The blog calls it the therapeutic relationship.
Yeah.
And the thing is, a therapist can have all the skills and knowledge in the world,
Mm-hmm.
but if you don't feel seen and heard and understood,
Right.
those techniques, they just won't work.
It's like trying to learn a language from someone you don't trust.
Exactly. You might pick up a few words, but you're not going to be fluent.
So this therapeutic relationship, it's all about trust and feeling comfortable.
Exactly. And imagine going to a therapist who like constantly interrupts you or is more interested in their notes than what you're saying.
Yeah.
Would you feel safe opening up to them?
No way.
Would you trust their guidance?
Probably not.
Yeah.
That reminds me of going to the doctor.
Yeah.
I'm way more likely to listen to them if I feel like they actually listen to me.
Exactly. It's the same with therapy. And this is where self-awareness is so crucial for the therapist.
Okay, how so?
Well, a therapist who's in tune with their own emotions,
Mm-hmm.
they're more likely to pick up on yours and understand your perspective and respond in a way that feels genuine.
So it's not just about empathy, it's about managing their own emotions so they don't mess with mine.
You got it. A therapist's own anxieties or insecurities could like unconsciously influence how they see you,
Oh, wow.
and that could lead to misunderstandings or even harm.
So self-awareness really is the foundation of good therapy.
Exactly. And it ties into another important point. The blog makes finding the right fit with a therapist.
Okay.
Because just like any relationship, sometimes it just doesn't click.
Even if the therapist is good.
Even if they're skilled and have good intentions, sometimes it's just not a match.
So it's okay to try out different therapists until I find one that feels right.
Absolutely. You might need to try therapists with different personalities or approaches or even genders.
It's like dating.
Kind of. It's about finding someone you feel comfortable with, someone you trust to guide you on this journey.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That brings up something that I found kind of unsettling, the idea that therapists are human too.
Yeah.
With their own issues, the blog calls them unresolved dilemmas.
Right. And it's something we don't talk about enough. It's easy to think of therapists as these perfect beings who have it all figured out.
Yeah, like they've got no problems of their own.
But the truth is, they're on their own journeys just like everyone else.
So what happens if a client brings up something that triggers the therapist's own stuff?
Well, that's why they have so much training and they're constantly reflecting on themselves. They learn to recognize their own emotional responses and separate their experiences from their clients' experiences.
So they have tools to deal with that.
They do, and they also talk to other therapists to help them see their blind spots.
So it's not about therapists being perfect. It's about them being self-aware enough to manage their own stuff so it doesn't affect their clients.
Exactly. It's about knowing they're human and making sure their clients' well-being comes first.
Okay, that makes sense. But how can I even tell if a therapist is self-aware?
That's a great question, and it's a tough one. There's no easy answer.
Right, it's not like it's on their business card.
Right. But there are some questions you can ask to get a better sense even in that first meeting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Okay, so how can you tell if a therapist is self-aware?
Well, it's kind of like being a detective, you know? You're looking for clues, but there are some questions you can ask that can give you a better idea even in that first meeting.
Okay, give me the goods.
Well, one thing you can do is ask about how they take care of themselves and how they keep learning as a therapist.
You could say something like, what do you do to stay on top of your game as a therapist?
Mm-hmm.
Their answer will tell you if they're still learning, if they get supervision from other therapists, or even if they go to therapy themselves.
Okay.
It's a good sign if they're still working on themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. It shows they're actually practicing what they preach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You could also ask about their experience with clients who have similar challenges to yours.
Like how?
You could say, have you worked with clients who are struggling with work-life balance,
Yeah.
And then dig a little deeper, like what were some of the challenges you faced? How did you handle those as a therapist?
Okay.
Their answers can tell you a lot about how self-aware they are and how they deal with tough
So
situations.
it's not just about what they've done, but how they talk about it?
Exactly. Pay attention to their tone and the examples they give. Do they admit when they don't know something?
Okay.
Do they seem to understand their clients? Do they take responsibility for their mistakes?
These are all good signs?
Right. Those are subtle but important clues about their self-awareness.
Wow. I'm learning so much about how to find a good therapist. This is great.
It's really important to find the right fit.
Speaking of finding the right fit, the blog mentioned that a good therapist might try different approaches to see what works best.
Right. Because in therapy, one size doesn't fit all.
So what does that look like?
Well, for example, a therapist might mainly use CBT, but they might also use mindfulness or psychodynamic therapy depending on what the client needs.
So they're not stuck in one way of doing things.
Exactly. The important thing is that they're adapting to each person.
So how can I tell if a therapist is open to different approaches? Can I just ask them?
Absolutely. You can just say, what's your approach to therapy?
Okay.
A self-aware therapist will tell you what they usually do,
Okay.
but they'll also say that they're flexible and that they'll work with you to find what's best.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. We've learned that self-awareness in therapists is so important for building trust and avoiding bias and figuring out how to work together and even choosing the right approach for each person.
It's not just a bonus. It's essential.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up, but I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay.
Knowing all of this, what qualities would you look for in a therapist? What questions would you ask to make sure they're self-aware and that they'll create a safe and supportive experience for you?
That's a great question. It puts you in the driver's seat, you know?
Exactly. Don't just settle for any therapist. Take the time to find someone who's right for you.
Finding a therapist who is self-aware can make a world of difference in your healing and growth.
That's so true. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into therapist self-awareness. We'll see you next time for another insightful conversation.